Welcome back to Bible 365 with Kathy Carter. And today is day 15. So, in day 15, I'm hoping you're sticking with me. We're still reading Genesis. So, in day 15, we are Genesis 40 through 41. There's also a little bit of Genesis 35 in there, but we are mostly covering 40 to 41. We have been here before. We're doing the 1 year chronological reading plan, which is a name brand. And so it's the 1 year chronological. And so we're going through the Bible in a historical context. So we left off yesterday with Joseph being in prison. Joseph is the son of Jacob, who is one of the twin sons of Isaac, who is the son of Abraham. So if anybody needs to remember those names, this is how he comes on down the line. And Joseph is one of, at this point, 11 sons, although we're going to meet a 12th son in this chapter, but he's one of 11. And at that point, he is the youngest, and he gets eventually thrown into jail. So he first gets put into slavery, and then eventually, through nothing that he has done, he gets put in jail. And so where we meet him today is he is currently serving time in jail. But in jail, he has found favor with the Lord. The Lord has blessed him in jail, and he has become essentially a leader over people. He's been able to take care of people in his area. I'm not sure exactly what that looked like, but the warden left him in charge of many people. And so we're going to see what comes of that. So immediately, what we see in verse 1 is sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his two officials and the chief cupbearer and the chief baker and put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard. So this is the same prison where Joseph was. So Joseph, because then it says the captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and Joseph attended them. So he's in there with Joseph, and then Joseph becomes they become his attendees, the people sort of underneath his care and who he's taking care of, probably to do any of their duties as well as to be fed or whatever else that they need. He's in charge of that whole area. So cupbearer and the baker kind of can figure out what both of those are. The cupbearer is either the one who just brings him his cups all the time, so he brings him his things, or the one who taste tests anything that comes in that cup to make sure that it doesn't kill anyone. So he could be either one of those things. And so we don't know what they did, but what we do know is that they were put in jail by Pharaoh. And so they seem to be really upset, and they both have dreams. And in both of their dreams, they come to they had heard that Joseph was an interpreter of dreams. So he asks them, "Why are you so down?" And then the cupbearer initially spills the beans. I had this dream last night, and so it says in verse 8, which I thought was interesting, because he says, the cupbearer says, "We both had dreams, but there is no one to interpret them." What I find interesting in this passage is I'm going to make the assumption that dreams were considered something important at the time, and there were a lot of interpretations of dreams. And for me personally, I find it really interesting because I have dreams every night that I remember. So I have very vivid, very colorful dreams, and I wake up every morning and I remember them. Now, they make absolutely no sense, probably as much sense as these dreams do, but I do always wonder if there's any meaning behind them, and if I'm just missing something, some kind of reliance on God to understand what any of them mean, or if there's purpose in any of the dreams that are sent to me, or if it's just something that comes up in the day. So I'm not 100% sure, but as I kind of move through my faith, I wonder more and more about that. So, but they say there's no one to interpret them. But then Joseph replies immediately, "Do not all interpretations belong to God?" And then he says, "Tell me your dream." So what he's recognizing is that God understands what all these dreams are. And so all interpretations come directly from God. And so then he says, "Tell me your dreams," which then would lead me to believe that he recognizes that through him, that God will interpret this dream, and he'll be able to explain to these guys what their dreams mean. So they do. And what we see first is that, and I don't want to go into too much explanation, but what we see first is the cupbearer has a dream about grapes. And what Joseph says to him is that he's going in 3 days, because it's always, both of the dreams are 3 days. So in 3 days, he is going to be restored. His head will be lifted up, it says, and he's going to be restored as the cupbearer. And then the baker sort of feels like, oh, well, he got a really nice interpretation, so I'm going to ask him to interpret mine. He has three hats and on or baskets, and in the basket is bread. Birds eat the bread, and so he asks what the dream is, and then Joseph shares with him that in 3 days his head will also be lifted up, but unfortunately he will be killed and he will be impaled. And I just want to stop at this moment and say how burdensome I feel it would be to have to share that dream with someone, that truth with someone, and how I know I'm led to candy coat things because I don't want to hurt anybody. And so I know I steer away from certain conversations, or I steer away from certain things, or if I feel I believe I know a truth, sometimes I'm fearful of saying it because I don't know how that person is going to react. I'm assuming that the baker did not have a good reaction to this. I'm sure he was pretty upset. But sadly, what we find out is in 3 days there was a birthday party for Pharaoh, and these things came true. And so what then Joseph said to the cupbearer who was restored is he said, when you are restored, remember me. Don't forget that I'm in here. And he says, and this is what I appreciate, that he says that it was through no fault of his own. And so I go back to one of the things that I was talking about yesterday about sort of fighting on our knees. He is fully understanding that he didn't do anything to deserve to be put where he is. And yet he is not, I don't want to say he's not fighting, because he certainly asks to be remembered and he certainly wants to be out of prison, but he's not doing anything against the law. He's not breaking the law in order to do that. He's just asking to be remembered. And then what we find is he's not remembered. The guy gets out and he doesn't remember Joseph. He doesn't say anything to Pharaoh about Joseph, or anything that Joseph did, any of the dreams that he interpreted. And so Joseph then continues to sit in prison. And while it might not be in a dungeon in prison, it's still prison. So I never want to forget that he is in a place of tragic suffering. This is not where first of all, this is not where he came from. He came from a home with a dad who loved him and gave him lots of stuff. If you remember his coat that was multicolored. And so it's not like he came from poverty or a bad place or anything that was even remotely like jail. He came from a place that was good, and he had gifts, and he had a father who loved him and doted on him. And so being in jail cannot be anything other than tragic compared to where he was. And yet he stays there and he's serving out whatever time he has. But he asks if he would be remembered. And he does something, of course, in there that will have him be remembered. So what we see is when we move on, we see in chapter 35, Isaac then passes away. So the father of Jacob and Esau, remember the twin brothers, that father passed away, which is the grandfather of Joseph, who we've been talking about. And so he passes away, and together Esau and Jacob bury him in the land of his fathers. He was gathered to his people. And so it looks like he lived a good and happy life. And then he died and was buried with his people. So moving on to chapter 41, it comes back to 2 years that have passed, and then Pharaoh has a dream, and Pharaoh has this dream. And one of the things that I want to point out about this dream is the amount of things that are in this dream. So in both dreams that he had, it was 7 and 7. And if you remember, there have been other things that have come up in the past that have been the number 7. And it might be something that I continue to bring up as we continue to see it in the Bible, but it was 7 cows, then 7 healthy cows, and then 7 emaciated cows, and then 7 healthy ears of corn, and then the emaciated, right? So the emaciated kernels eat the others. And so again, is this a number that just means complete, right? Like when this is done, it has fully completed, and then it's not going to happen again? Or is it a very literal 7 years? And maybe it's both, but it's just something that I put out there, that 7 seems to be this number that God continues to bring up in his book. So just wanting to look into that. Now, if we go to verse 15 and 16 in chapter 41, 15 and 16, it says, Pharaoh said to Joseph, so before we get to Pharaoh talking to Joseph, Joseph came up because Pharaoh had these two dreams. And then when he had these two dreams, he called all of his people, his wise men, his magicians, all his people to try and interpret the dream. And they were unable to do so. So again, seems like dream interpretation was something that happened quite often at this time. But none of them were able to. And then the cupbearer remembered Joseph. And he said, yeah, obviously this is the time. And he said, I remember this guy interpreted my dreams and remembered that you and told me that you were going to put me back as a cupbearer. And here I am. And so he asked to get Joseph out of prison. Joseph came out of prison. And so he says in 15 and 16, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream and no one can interpret it. But I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. What I want to note about this section is that Pharaoh is not an Israelite. He is in Egypt. He is not following the God of the Israelites, the God of the Hebrews, but he's following other gods. So historically, ancient Egypt had multitudes of gods. There are some bigger gods and there are some lesser gods, but they don't follow the one true God. And the reason I want to bring this to the attention is that uh, like Potiphar and like Pharaoh, they are using Joseph as a tool. Joseph has something to offer them. And that's something right at this point. So with Potiphar, it was that his land was growing and developing and becoming, or everything that he owned was growing and developing and becoming better, right? He was being blessed. And with Pharaoh, he has a dream that needs to be interpreted, and this guy is the man. So he's looking up and he's telling him, I need you to help me with this dream, right? So it has nothing to do with God or with faith or anything like that. And I bring that up because what we see is that everything for Joseph has to do with that. So he says, obviously, I had a dream, no one can interpret it. And then in verse 16, Joseph says, I cannot do it. And then he follows up by saying, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. So Joseph consistently puts God first, not because he's humble, not because he's trying to say, my God's better than your God, nothing like that. And I want to be really clear about that because sometimes I think it's seen as a false humility. We read some stuff into it that's our own thinking instead of reading the words as it is. Joseph believed that this was 100% from God. I would agree, obviously, but Joseph believes that this was from God and he wants to honor God and recognize that this gift that he has is a God given gift. And it is the God of the Hebrews, the God of the Israelites, the God of his fathers that he follows, that has been with them and has blessed them and that has given him this gift. So I just want to be clear, even in myself and in my own heart and my own thoughts, that the gifts and the talents that I have and anything that I have is a gift that has been given from God. Because some people are smarter than others, some people are more creative than others, some people can interpret dreams, some people can heal, some people can speak in tongues, right? Like we're all over the place with the gifts that we have. They are God given gifts, and we should be using them for the kingdom in order to bless others. So it's not just about us. It's really to bless. As a matter of fact, I would say it's not about us. It's about blessing other people with those gifts. And that's exactly what Joseph does here. So Joseph does interpret the dream and he lets him know exactly what's going to happen. He says that you're going to have 7 years of, so both of the dreams really encompass the same thing. You're going to have 7 years of abundance. You're going to have 7 years of famine. And then it's said twice. He said, because this is God's going to complete it fully and he's going to complete it soon. And so he warns him that you need to get wise men, you need to get people in charge, and you need to handle your business in a way that has this understanding that you're going to be in abundance and then you're going to be without. And that's going to be important, that your kingdom's going to be without. You're going to be in famine for 7 years. And I love this imagery because it makes me think of all of these times where, right, there are abundant years and there are bad years. And do we remember? Because he says they're not even going to remember those good years. It's going to be so bad, they're not even going to remember those good years. And so for my mind, it's a reminder when I have it good, and I do have it good. When I have it good, right? I have it good. And when I do have it good, when I have problems which come up all the time, I'm not without loss or without sadness or without fears or without anger. And when those things come up, can I remember that God is so loving, giving, and good, and He provided abundantly. So, whatever time period that was for me, it was an abundant providence. And can I remember that when I'm in famine? So we use these expressions, mountains and valleys, right? Like when you're on the mountain, sometimes we forget who God is, and when you're in the valley, you're kind of crying out to God. And so, but can I forget, or can I remember? Sorry, how good I had it, and how good I had it because God provided. Not how good I had it because I provided. God provided for me. He reminded me that this is going to be good, but He also reminds me that there's going to be some famine in my life. And so to store up some of those treasures from the abundance, to remember in my famine. And so I don't want to forget those things because He makes such a great picture of it. So, like I said, this has been given 2 times, so we remember. And then in verse 37, in verse 37, so then before we hit verse 37, what we find is that Joseph tells him to get all these people, and he says, I'm going to get you. I'm going to have you do this. You're very wise. You can do all these things. I'm going to have you help. And so in verse 37, Pharaoh asks, can we find anyone like this man, one whom the Spirit of God? And Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one as discerning or as wise as you. You shall be in charge of all my palace and all my people, and they are to submit to your orders. So he puts Joseph in this high place of honor that only Pharaoh is above him. Once again, just like we see, this is sort of a warm up when he was in Potiphar's house. Potiphar made him in charge of the entire household, and now Pharaoh is making him in charge of all of Egypt. So he is now in charge of everything. And then so we see in verse, he gives him a wife. He gives him all of his power and everything that signals that this man is above all in Egypt. Besides himself, he's the only person that gets to overrule it. And then in verse 46, so in verse 46, it says Joseph was 30 when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Now, the note here is that means because he was 17 when he was taken by his brothers and thrown into the cistern to start and then put into slavery. So that gives what, about he was 17, so 13 years. My math, I had it written down even, but my math is not great off the cuff. But so it was 13 years that he was in slavery and in jail. And so again, this was definitely a time of famine for him. And now he is getting to have some abundant blessings in the house of Pharaoh. Still not in his own home, though. Still not in his hometown. And then he goes to other lands, and he starts to, if I want to go to, in the 7 years, he had 2 sons. Both were named for God. So he gave both of them godly names. And then in verse 51, it says Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh, and it said, is because God made me forget all of my trouble, because he had plenty with his brothers, and all my father's household. The second son he named Ephraim, and said, it is because God made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. And so I would assume part of the suffering is when he was in prison. And so this wasn't the greatest of places, but now God has provided and made him fruitful. So again, he remembers that God provides to him. And then in verse 56, it says, when the famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout Egypt. So in those 7 years, he got food and everything else, and he brought it and he put it in these storehouses, and then the food ran out. And this was a famine that, it says all over the world, but it was in a very, very large area. I'm not sure if this is literal, if it's the entire world or just sort of the world as they knew it at that time. But whatever it was a very large encompassing area. So it was all into Egypt, all up into Canaan, all over those areas. And And so he stored, had like storehouses in all of the cities, it says. So anywhere that had large land masses, they had a storage area in their facility, which again housed food. When that food ran out, it housed grain, and then people started coming and purchasing grain, and he started selling that grain. So it says by verse 57, it says the world came to Joseph. So at this point, Joseph has been given a huge amount of power, uh, and he's been feeding the world essentially. So this is where we leave off for today. And as I always say, if this has been a blessing, I would love if you would listen. Obviously, I would love if you would subscribe. I would love if you would share and like this, please, so these videos keep popping up and so they get out to other people. And always my biggest and most important thing that I ask of all of you guys is to keep reading. So if you have tapered off from your reading because it's become a little bit more difficult and time consuming, I ask you come back to your reading. If this first year, this is all you are doing and it's listening, it's an amazing start. And I ask is the more you get conditioned into this, try and maybe read a little bit of it or try and get into some of the reading just because I am not an authority and I want the word is the authority, right? So this book that you're reading, that is the authority. It's not me, it's not my voice, it's not what I have to say. This is what I read when I look at it. But you may see something slightly different in there, and it's really important to develop that because this is what God is using through you. So God is doing the same thing in you that he does in me and anyone else who believes and loves him. So like, subscribe, share, and I'll see you next time.